The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the 23rd floor boardroom as David Chen pushed his mop bucket down the marble hallway. Through the glass walls, he could see them gathered around the polished conference table, suits and ties discussing numbers that would never touch his world. He had learned to move like a ghost during these late meetings, invisible to the executives who barely registered his presence. At the head of the table sat Akiko Yamamoto, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized leather chair. Even from the hallway, David could see the tension in her shoulders as Richard Sterling leaned forward, his voice carrying through the glass with that particular tone David had heard too many times. The tone that said your opinion doesn't matter. David squeezed the mop and continued his careful work, each stroke methodical and quiet. He had perfected this dance over the past 2 years, cleaning around their importance while staying completely unnoticed. But tonight something felt different. Akiko's hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through her papers, and Sterling's gestures grew more dismissive with each passing minute. The irony wasn't lost on David. Here he was, mopping floors in a building where he once would have commanded respect, watching a brilliant woman being diminished by men who understood nothing about the delicate art of international business. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are as this story unfolds? Through the glass, David saw Akiko's face flush red as Sterling interrupted her mid-sentence again. The young CEO's voice had grown so quiet that even the other board members were straining to hear her. David's grip tightened on the mop handle, remembering another time, another language, another life entirely. Sterling's voice boomed across the boardroom as he stood, straightening his expensive tie. "We need leadership that can actually communicate with our Western partners," he declared, his eyes never leaving Akiko's face. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared to challenge his increasingly bold statements. Akiko's fingers pressed against the documents before her, her knuckles white with tension. She had prepared for this meeting for weeks, crafting proposals that could revolutionize their Asian market expansion. But every time she began to speak, Sterling would interrupt with questions designed to fluster her, exploiting her careful English and quiet demeanor. David moved his mop in slow, deliberate arcs across the hallway floor, his ears attuned to every word. He had seen this performance before, in corporate boardrooms across 3 continents. The systematic dismantling of competence disguised as constructive criticism. The way Sterling positioned himself as the reasonable alternative while undermining the very person who should command their respect. The meeting stretched past midnight, and David knew his daughter Emma would be fast asleep in their small apartment, her homework completed and lunch prepared for tomorrow. She never complained about his night shifts, understanding even at 8 years old that this job meant they could spend their days together. That he could walk her to school and help with her projects, trading his days for her security. Through the glass, Akiko attempted once more to present her quarterly projections. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as Sterling tapped his pen impatiently against the table. The sound echoed like a metronome counting down her confidence, each tap another small humiliation in a room full of people who should have been listening to her wisdom instead of dismissing her strength. The elevator chimed softly as 3 distinguished Japanese executives emerged onto the 23rd floor. David recognized the unmistakable bearing of senior business leaders, their measured steps and careful observation of everything around them. They had flown halfway across the world for this partnership discussion, and their expectations would be precise and unforgiving. Margaret Foster, the board chairwoman, greeted them with practiced diplomacy, but David noticed how their eyes immediately searched for someone else. Someone who could bridge the cultural divide that Western executives consistently underestimated. Their polite smiles barely concealed their surprise when Sterling stepped forward as the primary representative. Akiko stood to welcome them, her bow perfectly executed, her Japanese flowing like music in the sterile boardroom. But Sterling quickly positioned himself between her and the visitors, his handshake firm and his English loud, as if volume could compensate for cultural ignorance. The Japanese executives exchanged the briefest of glances, a communication David understood perfectly. Papers scattered as Sterling gestured broadly, explaining market strategies without grasping the delicate protocols that governed such negotiations. David continued mopping near the boardroom entrance, close enough to observe the subtle signs of growing discomfort among the visitors. Their posture shifted almost imperceptibly, hands folded in ways that spoke of diplomatic patience wearing thin. One document fluttered to the floor outside the boardroom, and David quietly retrieved it. The contract amendments were written in both English and Japanese, the translations revealing nuances that Sterling would never comprehend. David's eyes moved across the characters with the fluency of someone who had once lived and breathed international business, recognizing immediately the cultural missteps unfolding just beyond the glass walls. Sterling slammed his palm against the conference table, the sound reverberating through the glass walls. "Frankly, I think this company needs leadership that can command respect in the global marketplace," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of manufactured authority. The Japanese executives stiffened at his aggressive tone, their faces carefully neutral as they witnessed this public humiliation of their potential business partner. Akiko's shoulders sagged as Sterling continued his calculated assault on her credibility. "She understands our local market, certainly, but international expansion requires a different kind of vision," he said, gesturing dismissively in her direction. The other board members looked anywhere but at their CEO, their complicity written in their silence. David wrung out his mop with more force than necessary, his jaw clenched as he watched the systematic destruction of a brilliant woman's confidence. He had seen Sterling's type before, men who mistook volume for leadership and aggression for strength. The Japanese visitors were now checking their watches, their body language screaming their desire to escape this uncomfortable display. Margaret Foster finally attempted to intervene, suggesting they take a brief recess, but Sterling waved her off. "The board needs to consider whether we have the right person leading us into the next quarter," he declared, his meaning unmistakable. Akiko's hands trembled as she gathered her papers, her proposals and projections suddenly feeling worthless in her grasp. The youngest Japanese executive whispered something to his colleague, and David caught the word disappointment in their quiet exchange. These men had come expecting to work with the brilliant mind behind Yamamoto International's recent innovations, only to find themselves trapped in Sterling's ego-driven performance. The partnership that could have elevated both companies was crumbling before their eyes. Dawn painted the kitchen windows golden as David quietly prepared Emma's lunch, the silence of their small apartment a stark contrast to the corporate drama he had left behind hours earlier. His daughter's school clothes lay neatly folded on her chair, her backpack organized with the precision that had once defined his business presentations in glass towers across the world. Emma emerged from her bedroom, her dark hair tousled from sleep, and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Morning, Daddy," she whispered, and David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with pure, unconditional love. She never asked why other fathers wore suits while hers smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, never questioned why their apartment was small while her classmates lived in houses with yards. Over pancakes, Emma chattered about her upcoming school presentation on different countries and their cultures. "I'm doing Japan," she announced proudly, and David's heart skipped slightly. "Her teacher said I should ask if you know anything about their customs since you're so smart about everything. What part of this story resonates most with you? Share your thoughts about the sacrifices parents make for their children." David helped her gather materials for her project, pulling out books he hadn't touched in years, volumes on international business and cultural protocols that had once been his daily tools. Emma's eyes widened at the detailed explanations he offered, not knowing that her father had once negotiated million-dollar deals in Tokyo boardrooms, speaking fluent Japanese to executives who treated him as an equal. As they walked to school together, David cherished these morning moments that made every midnight hour of mopping floors worthwhile. Emma's laughter echoed down the sidewalk, a sound more valuable than any corporate title he had ever held. The second night brought even higher stakes as David wheeled his cleaning cart past the boardroom where tension crackled like electricity. The lead Japanese executive, Mr. Tanaka, sat rigidly upright, his translator whispering urgently in his ear as Sterling paced behind the conference table like a predator claiming territory. "I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding," Tanaka said through his translator, his voice carrying the controlled disappointment that David recognized as a death knell for international partnerships. "The cultural protocols we discussed seem to have been disregarded entirely." Sterling's face reddened as he demanded to know what protocols, his ignorance laid bare before everyone in the room. Akiko attempted to explain the concept of saving face and respectful negotiation, but Sterling cut her off with a wave of his hand. "We're not in feudal Japan anymore," he snapped, and David watched the Japanese delegation's expressions freeze into polite masks that concealed their shock and offense. The youngest executive actually pushed back from the table, a gesture of profound disrespect in response to Sterling's cultural blindness. Margaret Foster tried desperately to salvage the situation, but the damage was spreading like cracks in ice. Tanaka stood slowly, gathering his papers with deliberate precision. "Perhaps we should reconsider this partnership entirely," he said, his English perfectly clear despite the translator's presence. "We require business relationships built on mutual respect and cultural understanding." Through the glass, David saw Akiko's face crumble as 2 years of careful relationship building dissolved in minutes. The contract worth $50 million was slipping away because Sterling couldn't grasp that respect was more valuable than dominance in the delicate dance of international business. The boardroom emptied like water draining from a broken vessel, leaving behind only the echoes of a partnership destroyed. David continued his methodical cleaning, pushing his cart toward the executive wing where a single light still burned in the corner office. Through the partially open door, he could see Akiko slumped over her desk, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Her laptop screen glowed with the presentation she had spent weeks perfecting, charts and projections that would never see the light of implementation. The carefully crafted proposals lay scattered around her like fallen leaves, each page representing hours of research and cultural consideration that Sterling had dismissed with arrogant ignorance. David paused outside her office, his hand gripping the mop handle as he wrestled with a decision that could change everything. For 2 years he had remained invisible, a ghost moving through their corporate world without leaving a trace. But watching this brilliant woman broken by the very ignorance he could easily remedy felt like a betrayal of everything he had once stood for. The sound of Akiko's quiet sobbing cut through his resolve like a blade. She whispered something in Japanese, words of frustration and self-doubt that pierced David's heart because he understood them perfectly. The language he had spoken fluently in boardrooms across Tokyo was calling to him now, demanding that he step out of the shadows. "Can you feel the tension building? What would you do in David's position when you have the power to help but everything to lose?" David set down his mop and knocked gently on the door frame. The moment had arrived when invisibility would no longer be an option, when compassion would override caution and change both their lives forever. "Yamamoto-san," David said softly in perfect Japanese, the words flowing from his lips like water from a long-sealed spring. Akiko's head snapped up, her tear-stained face a portrait of absolute shock as she stared at the janitor standing in her doorway. The formal honorific hung in the air between them, spoken with a precise pronunciation that comes only from years of cultural immersion. "You speak Japanese," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible as she tried to process what she had just heard. David stepped into her office, his janitor's uniform suddenly seeming like a costume hiding his true identity. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, but seeing her pain had made the choice inevitable. Tanaka-san was not angry about the contract terms, David continued in flawless Japanese, his voice gentle but confident. "He was offended by the lack of respect shown to you as the rightful leader of this company. In Japanese business culture, diminishing the CEO in front of international partners is considered deeply shameful." Akiko's eyes widened as she realized this janitor understood not just her language, but the intricate cultural dynamics that had destroyed her evening. David moved closer, picking up one of her scattered proposals and scanning it with the practiced eye of someone who had once lived in this world. "Your expansion strategy is brilliant," he said, switching back to English. "The market analysis shows deep understanding of both cultures. Sterling's approach would have failed within 6 months because he doesn't comprehend the concept of long-term relationship building." Akiko stared at him as if seeing a ghost materialize before her eyes. "Who are you?" she asked in Japanese, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. David sank into the chair across from Akiko's desk, the weight of his hidden life settling between them like a bridge finally ready to be crossed. 5 years ago, I was David Chen of Chen International Consulting, he said quietly, watching her eyes widen with recognition. I specialized in Asian market expansion and spoke 6 languages fluently. My clients included companies very much like this one. Akiko leaned forward, her tears forgotten as pieces of an impossible puzzle began falling into place. Chen International, she repeated, her voice filled with awe. I read your market analysis papers in graduate school. Your work on cultural integration was groundbreaking. But why are you here, cleaning floors in my building? David's hands found the wedding ring he still wore, turning it slowly as memories surfaced like bubbles from deep water. My wife Sarah was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, he explained, his voice steady despite the pain behind his words. The treatments were experimental and expensive. I mortgaged everything, spent every penny of our savings, took on consulting projects around the clock to pay for her care. The silence stretched between them as Akiko absorbed this revelation, understanding beginning to dawn in her dark eyes. When Sarah died, David continued, Emma was only 6 years old and completely lost. I could have returned to consulting, rebuilt my career, but she needed her father more than I needed my former life. Night janitor work meant I could be with her during the day, help with homework, make her lunch, walk her to school. Akiko's breath caught as she realized the magnitude of his sacrifice. You gave up everything for your daughter, she whispered, and David nodded, meeting her gaze with quiet dignity that spoke of choices made from love rather than regret. Akiko's office transformed into a war room as she and David spread the contract documents across her desk, their collaboration transcending the artificial barriers that had separated them hours earlier. Will you help me save this partnership? She asked, her voice filled with newfound determination and respect for the man who had chosen love over ambition. David studied the proposal with the analytical mind that had once commanded 6-figure consulting fees. The foundation is solid, he said, pointing to key sections, but Tanaka-san needs to see that you understand the deeper concepts of obligation and long-term commitment. In Japanese business culture, partnerships are marriages, not casual dating arrangements. They worked through the cultural nuances that Sterling had trampled with his aggressive approach, David explaining the subtle art of indirect communication and respectful negotiation. Akiko's confidence grew with each insight, her natural brilliance finally supported by someone who understood both the language and the delicate protocols that governed international relationships. The morning sun painted the office walls gold as they prepared for the crucial follow-up meeting. David helped Akiko restructure her presentation to emphasize relationship building over immediate profits, teaching her phrases that would signal deep respect for Japanese business traditions. If this story is touching your heart, let us know where you're listening from as we witness this incredible partnership unfold. As they reviewed the final details, Akiko looked at David with eyes full of gratitude and amazement. You could have stayed invisible forever, she said softly. Why did you choose to help me? David smiled, thinking of Emma sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, and answered simply, because sometimes the right thing to do is also the brave thing to do. The boardroom filled with tension as Tanaka and his delegation returned, their faces carefully neutral but their body language speaking volumes about their reluctance to continue negotiations. Sterling positioned himself at the head of the table again, but this time Akiko stood with quiet confidence, her posture transformed by the knowledge and support she had gained through the night. Tanaka-san, Akiko began in perfect Japanese, her voice carrying the respectful formality that David had coached her to employ. I deeply apologize for the cultural misunderstandings of yesterday evening. Please allow me to demonstrate the true values and vision of Yamamoto International. Sterling's mouth fell open as she continued speaking flawlessly in Japanese, explaining complex business concepts with the cultural sensitivity he had completely ignored. David stood quietly in the corner, no longer invisible but present as Akiko's cultural advisor, his janitor uniform somehow irrelevant in the face of his obvious expertise. Tanaka's eyebrows rose as Akiko introduced David as her international business consultant, and the Japanese executive's entire demeanor shifted when David bowed properly and spoke in flawless Japanese about mutual respect and long-term partnership building. Sterling sputtered protests about protocol and proper procedures, but Margaret Foster silenced him with a sharp look as the Japanese delegation leaned forward with renewed interest. Tanaka asked David directly about market penetration strategies, and David's responses demonstrated such deep understanding of both cultures that the entire room fell silent with amazement. The transformation was complete as Akiko presented her restructured proposal with David's cultural insights woven seamlessly throughout. Tanaka smiled for the first time in 2 days, nodding appreciatively as he recognized the respect and understanding that had been missing from Sterling's aggressive approach. 3 weeks later, David walked into Yamamoto International wearing a suit for the first time in years, carrying the business cards that read Cultural Liaison Consultant in both English and Japanese. The $50 million partnership had been signed, and Tanaka himself had requested that David oversee all future cultural integration projects between the companies. Akiko smiled as she watched him settle into his new office, the same floor where he had once pushed a mop cart through corridors of indifference. Sterling had quietly resigned after the board meeting where his cultural incompetence had been laid bare, replaced by managers who understood that respect was the foundation of international success. The afternoon sun streamed through David's office windows as Emma burst through the door, her school backpack bouncing with excitement. "Daddy," she exclaimed, "your office is so cool. Can I do my homework here sometimes?" David lifted her onto his lap, marveling at how life could transform so completely when courage finally overcame fear. Margaret Foster stopped by to congratulate him again, mentioning that 3 other companies had already inquired about his consulting services. But David's eyes were on Emma as she spread her Japanese culture project across his desk, the same project that had reminded him of skills he thought were buried forever. Akiko appeared in the doorway, holding tea and speaking softly in Japanese to Emma, who giggled and attempted to respond in her growing vocabulary. Subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one, because sometimes the most extraordinary transformations happen when we choose compassion over comfort, when we step out of the shadows to help others find their light. David watched his daughter and his new partner, knowing that some endings are really just beautiful beginnings wrapped in the courage to be seen.